IVM.
We would like to thank Storytel for sponsoring this show. Storytel is an audiobook platform that's available on your mobile, on your PC, wherever you'd like to listen to this. So what I'm going to recommend this week is a story that I first read when I was in school. It's Kabuliwala by Rabindranath Tagore. I, of course, read this in Hindi. It was part of my Hindi text. The original is in Bengali, but you know what Storytel has? It has an English translation of this story. And it's not just this story. There are a number of Rabindranath Tagore stories that they have. They have The Hungry Stones. They have The Solemn Vision. They have Forsake. Really, really good stuff. So, definitely go check it out. Get a bunch of Rabindranath Tagore books in your first month. And go and sign up at storytel.com/IVM and you'll be able to get your first month for just 99 rupees instead of $2.99. That's $200 off your first month. Go, go, go now.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. Normally, when we talk about Southeast Asia on this podcast, it's usually in the context of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations or ASEAN or something, to do with the Indo-Pacific or some action that China has taken. India keeps insisting that Southeast Asia is very important to it. Many years ago, it announced this Look East policy, which was later rebranded an Act East policy. And, we do talk about this a lot in this podcast. If you open up any Indian government press release connected to Southeast Asia, there'll be all these usual homilies about ancient ties between the subcontinent and Southeast Asia. There are these cliched words you'll come across like Swarna Bhumi. But I want to go beyond all of that in today's episode. And I'm joined by Anirudh. What we really want to understand is what is the character of the ties between India and Southeast Asia? And what is it that we're really misunderstanding about them? Anirudh, firstly, welcome. And I'm so glad we're finally getting to have this conversation because it's quite tiring to hear these same old cliches being recycled. What I want to understand is, what do you think is the biggest, perhaps, misconception that we have about Southeast Asia and the ties between Southeast Asia and India historically?
Let me give you a simple example. I've suddenly become very active on Twitter recently. And I tend to just generally check the profiles of people who follow me so I can make sure that they're not loonies, because I have a limited amount of time and space to use on Twitter. And I very often find that even generally sensible folks who have sensible takes on most things will kind of uncritically retweet stuff like, oh, here is the entire Ramayana carved on some cliffside in Bali. And it'll have a hashtag Hinduism and hashtag India. And that's what I find so surprising. It would be equivalent to, somebody in Europe, for example, retweeting an image of a Ethiopian rock-cut cave church and saying, hashtag France. Which is just so utterly absurd to me. Very often when we talk about Southeast Asia, especially as far as India's historical consciousness is concerned, we're all like, oh yeah, Southeast Asia, Hindus, they were part of India only. They were just like us Indians. There's no difference between us and them. Why are they not more like India today? Is it because of certain other religions, whatever? In another context, they show up when we talk about, for example, the Chora Empire, and we say, oh yeah, the Chora Empire went and conquered and invaded Southeast Asia, and they ruled over Southeast Asia. That's where our knowledge of Southeast Asia kind of begins and ends. But hopefully the case that I'll be able to make in today's podcast is that Southeast Asia has a really fascinating, complex and unique history. And if you want to understand the history of the world and more importantly, the history of India as well, not just the Indian subcontinent, but also the concept of the modern nation state of India, you can't do it unless you really understand Southeast Asia. Just understanding the history of the Southeast Asian kingdoms, how their religions kind of interacted with India, the ways in which these guys saw themselves and just how unique that was, and the ways that they did things that no Indian state managed to do, I think will hopefully give us a more sensible understanding not only of how Southeast Asians see themselves, but also how Indians should see themselves and their relationship to Southeast Asia, rather than seeing it as this kind of our inferiors in a way who were so impressed by our culture and our religion, to see them as our equals who along with us participate in creating the unique intellectual world that characterized the Indian worldview, I think will help us build a more nuanced understanding of the region.
All right, let's go to the very beginning. When can we start tracing the beginnings of a cultural exchange between the subcontinent and Southeast Asia?
So it's not as far back as one would assume. It actually starts from roughly around the 4th, 5th century. The 4th, 5th century is really when you start to see recognizably Indian stuff like, various gods and various forms of worship being starting to appear in Southeast Asia. But interaction between Southeast Asia and India is actually far, far older than that. In fact, Southeast Asia is widely believed to have been one of the places where rice was first domesticated. And it's perfectly possible that it was through Southeast Asian traders that rice as a crop first reached the shores of India far, far before this in like the late, in perhaps the first millennium BCE or so. And that might sound a little surprising because you didn't really have any major Indian kingdoms in the Gangetic Plains at that time. You also didn't have any major Southeast Asian kingdoms. But the Southeast Asians were still already exploring the world at that time. These guys are among the most extraordinary navigators in all of human history. If you look at the many thousands of archipelagos and islands that are scattered across the Pacific, they were really colonized by people who initially started out in Southeast Asia. The Southeast Asian peoples had this almost natural affinity with the sea, where they would move from coast to coast. Every time that a particular area grew too populated, a bunch of people would basically get into a few ships and set out in search of like new lands to settle down in. And that in itself is one of the most remarkable stories in human history. And it's a real shame that I personally could not find any books just talking about history of the Polynesian peoples and their great expeditions that they must have done. Because you have to understand that you were talking about a time before when all navigation was done by the stars, where you had to have a profound understanding of marine ecology, the way that swells were moving, what kind of storms could be expected in what season. And you're talking about people who are relying on the wind to kind of move their ships, to propel their ships, and therefore had to go with where the wind and the tide took them. And even though these are, again, pre-literate, pre-state societies, they're still extraordinarily sophisticated in terms of the amount of knowledge that they had. If you look at Madagascar, for example, this is something that not a lot of people know, but the people of Madagascar are not descended from Africans, even though it's only a few hundred miles from the African coast. They're descended from Southeast Asians, which is literally thousands of miles away from them. So again, these are a truly remarkable and very exploratory, very adventurous kind of people. But yeah, coming back to the earliest interaction with India, right? So this again seems to have been a result of trade. And even though we see Indian religions appearing in Southeast Asia, I personally think that it's very likely that the main carriers of this influence were not Indians, but rather Southeast Asians themselves. Because it was the Southeast Asians who were, as I said, navigating the seas. And perhaps it was the Southeast Asians who brought Indians, the Indian trade partners with them to the coasts of Southeast Asia. Now, I say Southeast Asia, but as a single entity, but of course it's a very, very diverse landscape. There's a whole bunch of different islands that we can talk about. But for our purposes, it's really important to understand that you have broadly the island of Sumatra, and you have the Malay Peninsula, which between them have a very narrow strait, the Straits of Malacca, which are among the most important geopolitical choke points of the world today. And as you can imagine, were also an important geopolitical choke point back then. So basically you would have ships that would come down and like pass through the Straits of Malacca and then kind of round the coast of modern day Vietnam and then move all the way to China, which was one of the great markets of the ancient ancient world. And as you can imagine, since these are all ships that are propelled by wind, they perpetually have to keep stopping to kind of trade, to get supplies, to get repairs. And so a lot of these areas, particularly the Straits of Malacca, the coast of Vietnam, the Gulf of Siam especially, start to see these kind of trading settlements start to grow. And you start to see people of Indian descent start to settle down there, bringing with them the immense theology and the immense body of knowledge that has already been built up in India by that time.
Right. Now, we do see evidence of state formation in India earlier than we do in Southeast Asia. Religion and religious ideas do seem to move from India to Southeast Asia, not so much the other way. When does this begin, and what is the evidence we have for it?
So, like I said, it's really in the early centuries of the Common Era that this starts to happen. One useful tool that I find for thinking about this, because many people say that, since it's clearly Indian religions that are going to Southeast Asia, then clearly there's some superiority. India is clearly the superior here. Why else are Southeast Asians kind of accepting Indian religions? And the example that I always come back to is the Deccan. Now, if you look at the Gangetic Plains versus the Deccan, they both actually start to use iron tools at almost roughly the same time. But the Deccan doesn't necessarily evolve these very large urban centers until the last few centuries of the Common Era, or really the last century, as it were, of the Common Era. And now, why is that? Now, I think that a lot of it is really to do with geography. The North Indian plains simply are just much better irrigated. They are much better suited for agricultural surplus. They are much better suited for growing these large urban centers and large populations. And inevitably, when you have large populations, you are going to have a lot of intellectual ferment and a lot of philosophical ideas being developed. That's just the human condition. But that doesn't necessarily mean that societies in North India were older than societies in the Deccan were. And like I said earlier, very obviously, we do have evidence that there were societies in Polynesia and in Southeast Asia at the time that were fairly sophisticated and not necessarily urban. By virtue of not being as populous, they don't necessarily have hierarchical structures. They don't necessarily have a very well-developed theology. They don't necessarily have this deep philosophy of kingship, and they don't necessarily have these royal rituals and religious rituals associated with royalty that are used to maintain hierarchical societies. So in the Deccan, for example, we start to see that they are adopting some ideas from northern India in roughly the early centuries of the Common Era, right? When you see the Satavahana Empire emerging. But the Satavahana Empire is also very much a beast of its own, even though it's taking some influence from North India, is doing its very best to do its own thing. One especially unique thing that the Satavahanas have, for example, is that clearly they're a tribal coalition that is adopting elements of royal kingship and royal ritual from developed centers in northern India. But at the same time, you see that their kings are very obviously bearing their maternal descent on their sleeves. So you see, for example, kings who describe themselves as Gautami Putra or Vashishti Putra. And they try to use languages that are not as much of a thing in North India, such as Prakrit, for example, and try to make them their own. And you see something very similar with happening in Southeast Asia as well. If you look at the very earliest kingdom, as it's called, in Funan, Funan is very often known in India because supposedly a Brahmin called Kaundinya went there, and Kaundinya is supposed to have come from India, and he set up irrigation, blah, blah, blah. And this is proof that, Brahmins and Indians were so civilized. But there's a lot of other ways to also interpret this. Clearly, something new was happening in Funan in the 4th, 5th centuries. And what most scholars think is that you did have some Indians who were settling down there. And these Indians were bringing with them the knowledge of this very sophisticated hierarchical society. And that local people who were there were intermarrying with these Indians, are kind of using these foreign rituals to kind of put on a performance for their for local citizens and local subjects, and saying, hey, look, we're intermarrying with these very cool foreigners, and we're bringing this very cool foreign religion with us. So you guys should really listen to us, and you guys should take us seriously, and look at this amazing language that we are using. Look at this amazing ritual apparatus that we're using. Aren't you impressed by all this? And also look at this technology that we're starting to implement in our cities. We're starting to dig canals. We're starting to use irrigation. We're starting to dig wells, and we're starting to urbanize. So for all the relatively less urbanized and the relatively less organized agricultural communities or hunter-gatherer communities of Southeast Asia at that time, the Kingdom of Funan would have been this very new and modern and world-facing polity. Which is the way that we should see these places, rather than seeing them as being inspired by India. They're taking elements of like Indian stuff that is useful to their local societies and using that to kind of build up their power, just as the Satavahanas did.
Right. I get the sense that Southeast Asians were, doing what, for instance, the Deccan was doing itself, right, by adopting North Indian customs and mores, and in a sense that Indians in general have done with all sorts of cultures, most notably with Persianate culture.
Exactly.
If the Southeast Asians are incorporating these Indian mores, Indian customs, religions, languages for their own purposes, what are those purposes and how do they differ from the way these are practiced in India?
So one really great example is to look at Cambodia. Cambodia is essentially this very low-lying, like vast, flat land with some major rivers flowing through it. And Funan, which I just mentioned, is basically on the southern, it's close to the southern shores of the Gulf of Siam. And after the collapse of the Funan kingdom, you start to see more and more polities, like very deep within Cambodia, suddenly starting to adopt this new kind of quote-unquote Indian culture, where you see temples start to emerge. You start to see people using Sanskrit titles, for example. Now, one thing that's often been like talked about is how a lot of the names that these early kingdoms of Cambodia use, like a lot of these kings will call themselves something Varman. So they'll call themselves Jayavarman and stuff like that. And the way that people have interpreted this is by saying that, hey, look, in South India, the Pallavas are also calling themselves something Varman. So clearly the Pallavas were influencing and ruling over Cambodia, which is just an absurd argument, because there's clearly so many unique things that are happening in Cambodia as well. The reason why these kings are taking on the title of Varman is to claim that they are the protectors of the people. And very often these kings would have a name in Khmer, the language of Cambodia, and also have a name in Sanskrit to kind of show that they're participating in this high courtly world. Now, a great example of this can be found from the Deccan as well. We know that the Rashtrakuta dynasty of the Deccan, for example, came to power by overthrowing the Chalukya dynasty. In general, a lot of these Rashtrakuta and Chalukya kings are known only by their grand Sanskrit names. So we know, for example, Vikramaditya, Vinayaditya, Vijayaditya, Amoghavarsha, all these fancy Sanskrit titles. But there's this very interesting inscription that comes from a time when the Rashtrakutas had just overthrown the Chalukyas, when a Rashtrakuta king refers to his Chalukya rival as Rahapa. Rahapa is very obviously a very Dravidian and a very Kannada kind of name. So the same guy Rahapa is also known by his Sanskrit title as Kirtivarman II. Evidently, what you're seeing here is a very similar dynamic where you have a society that retains its local culture, its local elements, its local language, but is also adopting this more prestigious culture to kind of signify their participation in this elite world. And the same thing happens with Cambodia as well. You see these elites starting to build temples to kind of show how important they are. You see them assigning lands to these temples, and very interesting, you see them using these temple trusts as a way to kind of gather more land and more power and more resources and more trade goods to themselves. And then as they're doing that, they slowly start to adopt Sanskrit titles. So once again, there's this fascinating parallel. But there's also a lot of uniqueness. Now, one thing that really sets Cambodia apart, in my opinion, is how important the worship of ancestor spirits is. And very often the ancestor spirits are believed to reside in stones. So there's a very early parallel that starts to emerge, because you're also putting these stones and carving them and worshipping them as idols. There's this parallelism that emerges, this kind of syncretic understanding of this Indian religion as also being about propitiating the ancestors. So these Cambodian kings are not just propitiating the gods by building these temples and by worshipping at these shrines, but they're also worshipping the ancestors. When you start to see the emergence of a royal Shiva cult in Cambodia, which happens with this king called Jayavarman II, people are very often very impressed and say, hey, wow, this guy is worshipping Shiva. Again, he's very obviously influenced by Indian religions. And to an extent, perhaps that's true, but Jayavarman also does this very unique thing where he sets up something called the Devaraja cult. And this royal, and so Devaraja basically means king of the gods. And there are multiple interpretations as to what this actually means. But the one that has the most scholarly acceptance now is that the Devaraja cult was basically a lingam of Shiva that would always accompany the king of Angkor wherever he went. That again is kind of unique. You don't see a single aspect of Shiva being associated with every dynasty, with every king in any Indian polity. So that's something that's unique to Cambodia. And more importantly, the Angkor king's worship of Shiva, which was meant to bring Shiva's power into the world, was also meant to ensure that he was propitiating the ancestors of the Cambodian people and bringing their blessings into the world, which once again is a totally unique take and totally unlike the way that we see Indian kings engaging with religions such as Shaivism, for example.
Yeah, that's fascinating. They're clearly using religion, the same religious symbols, the same deities in very different ways. Now, how did the polities of Southeast Asia differ from those of India, and what effect or impact did that have on their ideas of architecture? For example, you do see vast temple complexes, most obviously Angkor Wat. Are these conceived in a different way from those in India? Is there importance in, is their importance or their relation to political authority different than it is in India?
In some ways, yes, but also in some ways, no. The most significant difference is that the concept of a mandala is rather different in both India and Southeast Asia, though there are also some similarities. If you look at Indian inscriptions, for example, they will talk about a Raja Mandala, and they will talk about how a king has, subordinated all these other kings and has kind of intermarried with all these other royal families and so on and so forth. And inevitably, Indian kings would build temples, and these temples would be covered in iconography that very often kind of reflects political messaging. One great example, perhaps, is the Lokeshwara or Virupaksha temple in Pattadakal, again built by the Chalukya kings of the Deccan. And there you see a lot of imagery of of Narasimha and Hiranyakashipu. You see a lot of imagery of Arjuna and Shiva wrestling and all that. And it's been theorized that all of these are references to the great struggle that the Chalukyas had with their rivals, the Pallavas. Many Pallava kings had the title Narasimha Varman. That might be one of the reasons why the Chalukyas chose to kind of reappropriate Narasimha imagery for their own temples. But if you look at an Indian temple, right, it's very often it's a fairly compact kind of building. It's set out in a very well-defined courtyard with walls and so on. And usually there's a reservoir near to it that's meant for ablutions, for bathing and so on. But what you see in Southeast Asia is that from the very earliest period, they start to incorporate imagery of ancestors into their temples. Now, again, this kind of varies. Southeast Asia is a very vast region, and I really don't want to oversimplify it. You have to keep in mind that what I'm going to tell you now is very different in, for example, the island of Sumatra. It's very different in the island of Java. It's very different in the area of Champa, which is southern Vietnam. But let's talk about Cambodia for now, because Cambodia has a whole bunch of archaeological evidence and is perhaps most recognizable to us because of the similarities in the scale of the temples and the polities and so on. If you look at very early temples built by the most powerful kings, the kings of Angkor, you see that from the very outset, they start to build temples that are covered with sculptures that are meant to represent their ancestors. So rather than have these relatively abstract and kind of subtle political messaging where gods are basically acting out the politics of mortals in a way, you see people that are basically, how do I put this? You see, for example, a representation of Vishnu or Shiva with a little label telling you that it's actually meant to represent this or that prince, this or that relative of the king. So that's what happens in the very earliest stage. But very soon after that, Cambodians get very interested with this idea of Meru, and Mount Meru as a kind of symbol of the cosmos. And they start to build these massive and very, very tall temple complexes that are meant to reflect the scale of Mount Meru, this mountain that's at the center of the cosmos. And they also start to enclose this Meru-like temple with a vast moat. Not a reservoir like what Indian temples have, but a moat. And that is meant to represent how Mount Meru is supposed to be surrounded by these concentric oceans of milk and water and payasam and so on, which is so interesting. That leads to a very distinct kind of architecture where the emphasis suddenly becomes on more and more monumental representations of the entire cosmos. Whereas in the Deccan, for example, you see a tendency to decorate temples more and more lushly with kind of with decorative elements and like kind of scale back on the iconographic elements to some extent. You might wonder why this obsession with Meru, and this again ties back to the concept of the mandala that I was talking about earlier. Whereas in India, the mandala appears in texts, for example, it appears in manuscripts, it appears in religious contexts. It appears that in Southeast Asia, the mandala was meant to be a very, very physical and realistic depiction of how the entire polity itself was organized. So the temple that the king built would house his ashes, for example. It would be associated with him throughout his lifetime. And the whole idea with building these colossal temple complexes was for them to act as a focus of devotion of the vassals and as a focus of devotion of the subjects towards the king. So it represents not only the cosmos, but also represents the kingdom itself with various people who are in various degrees closer to or further from the king. And that again ties back to this overall theme of what we're talking about, right? Where you have these similarities, but also these very distinct ways of thinking about things in the Southeast Asian worldview.
So before we wrap this up, Anirudh, I want to, do a sort of, if you will, case study. I want to maybe go into the city of Angkor. This is something that I know you've been reading the last few weeks about. Tell us about the city, the complex, and what it tells us about monarchs like Suryavarman, and also maybe contrast that once again to India at the same time, in the 12th and 13th centuries.
Angkor is a truly fascinating place because there's been so much interesting archaeological work done on it that I really wish would be done for medieval Indian cities as well. But we have a much better sense of how this grand medieval city would have looked than we know for like any other contemporary Indian city of the time. And what it tells us is like, it's truly astounding. This city was spread out over hundreds of square kilometers. And you can imagine at its center were these gigantic Meru-like temple complexes surrounded by these very intricate systems of like canals and hydraulics that were used for everything from transportation to irrigation and so on. And the water for all of this was like brought from like these very, very distant mountains in the north of Cambodia. So if you really think about the kind of engineering knowledge that it takes to do something like this, it's extremely impressive. It's extremely impressive. And what you see is that over time, the city of Angkor has these periods where these new kings and new dynasties come in and like radically change things up. So this guy that you mentioned, Suryavarman, is a very interesting character because he is the guy who built Angkor. And he builds Angkor to be a mausoleum for himself and also to establish his unique relationship with Vishnu. Angkor Wat, as a lot of our listeners might know, is a Vishnu temple, but a lot of the older and like most major temple complexes of Cambodia up till that time were actually Shiva temples. So was something happening that led to a rise in popularity of Vaishnavism at the time? Is perfectly possible because, as we know, just a few decades before that, we had seen the emergence of Sri Vaishnavism in South India. And you see another South Indian king, a guy called Vishnuvardhana, suddenly adopting Vaishnavism and building this gigantic temple in Belur, which again is a contemporary of the temple that was built in Angkor. So it's so interesting to see this both of these emerging at roughly the same time, but taking on such distinct kind of manifestations. And if you look at, for example, the temple at Belur, you don't really see much of it until you actually get into the courtyard. Whereas Angkor Wat itself has a very, very imposing facade, covered in these pillars, these colonnaded walkways. And as you get in, it progressively gets larger and larger until you feel like you're standing in front of a temple mountain. Whereas when you enter Belur, at some point there was also a very, very tall dome on top of the main shrine, which would have been extremely imposing. But the impression you get in Belur is not necessarily of monumentality so much as this kind of extraordinary profusion of sculptures and this geometrical complexity, as it were. But I'm getting distracted. Let's come back to Angkor. So it has all these unique hydraulics, and it has and these temple mountains also act as the kind of centers of these huge districts where you have priests and people of various different religions who are coming there. And we can imagine that all of them would have been primarily of Cambodian descent. So while you would have had people who are capable of writing Sanskrit poetry that would compete with any salon in North India or South India, these would have been people of Cambodian descent. There would have been Cambodian Sanskrit grammarians. There would have been Cambodian Shaivite and Vaishnavite ritual experts and various different sects competing for royal patronage. And we also see, quite interestingly, that in Cambodia, you would have kings basically grant caste status to various people. It wasn't like a pan-societal thing, but people who are very close to the king, for example, would be granted the title of honorary Brahmin, honorary Kshatriya, honorary Shudra, that kind of thing, to reflect how close they were to the royal court. Again, a very distinct way in which these guys are engaging with what we would think of as an Indian concept, right? Now, roughly, I think in the late 12th century or so, this really remarkable thing happens where one of the neighboring kingdoms of Cambodia, the kingdom of Champa, which again, I really wish we had the time to talk about Champa because it is this very unique place. So these guys are based in southern Vietnam, and once again, you see them also engaging with Indian religions and cultures in their own unique ways. These guys do this astounding invasion of Cambodia, where they basically sail a fleet all the way up the Mekong River, get to the Great Lake at the heart of Cambodia, which on the shores of which is Angkor Wat, is the city of Angkor. And they basically sack the city, and eventually see the rise of this new chap called Jayavarman the Seventh. This guy was apparently just some kind of general who rose to power. He rises to prominence by defeating the Chams and basically going and sacking their city, and then indulges in this massive kind of renovation and architectural renewal of the city of Angkor. But as you can imagine, right? So Angkor is the biggest urban complex. It has the largest population. So the men of Angkor are perpetually being called out to go and fight wars and kind of defend their frontiers. And as the population is growing, the engineers of Angkor are kind of tapping the rivers that feed the city closer and closer to their source, which means that the waters that are coming to the city contain less and less nutrients. And because of the constant movement of the workforce, you're not seeing enough maintenance of the canals. So slowly the canals and the reservoirs start to silt up. The soil is not nutritious enough for the entire population of the city to be maintained. And slowly you start to see challenges coming in from other ethnicities, other groups. So for example, you see the Thais especially starting to go to war. They start to go to war with the kings of Angkor. They defeat them. Eventually the great temple complex is kind of abandoned, and Phnom Penh, the modern capital of Cambodia, is established. And you see the Thais themselves again start to do their own unique thing, where they start to establish their own capitals. Once again, there's a tendency to think of them as, hey, these guys are just adopting Indian ideas, Indian religious ideas, but they're really not. When the Thais establish a capital, they call it Ayodhya, but I don't think they call it Ayutthaya, which is obviously Ayodhya. They don't call it because of the influence of Indian religions, but rather because the Cambodian kings associate themselves so closely with Rama. So obviously what the Thais are trying to do is kind of supplant this idea of Rama worship by kind of incorporating Rama into their own royal cult, as it were. Which is, again, so fascinating. We don't think of Southeast Asians as taking religious cues from each other. We always think of them as taking it from India. But obviously, it stands to reason that if they're doing their own spin on religions, obviously they're going to be taking their own spins from each other rather than like looking to India for inspiration always. So yeah, that was my rant about Angkor. What a fascinating polity, what a unique and what a fascinating polity. We weren't able to talk about like trade and all the interesting things that Southeast Asians did in that front. But let me tell you, there is so much to talk about. Obviously, talking about Southeast Asia in a single episode is like trying to talk about the history of India in a single episode, right? That's not going to happen. But I hope that like through the course of this conversation, you've all like gotten a sense of just what a unique place it is and just how unique and innovative these people are, to be the descendants of these great seafarers, and to also be these magnificent engineers, to have these innovative takes on religion, on urbanism, and to really just do their own thing. And I hope that that kind of provokes us to think a little bit about the unique ways, not just in which Southeast Asians engaged with what we think of as Indian culture, but also the way that South Indians engage with what we think of as Indian culture while maintaining their own kind of ancestral traditions. And hopefully that should make us think a little bit about how, what a conveniently defined thing this idea of Indian culture and Indian religions are. Because clearly, who do they belong to when you have millions of people across this enormous geographical landmass for hundreds of, if not thousands of years, adding their own things to it and taking their own things from it? It really makes you think. You know, it says a great deal about our very fixed and fossilized notions of nation state and natural culture, to kind of see Southeast Asia and use it to think more deeply about the ways that South Indians, who really are their own distinct people, have engaged with this culture, and what kind of implications that has for our concepts of national identity in the 21st century.
Well, that's very nicely summarized, Anirudh. We've gone from discussing Southeast Asia to, opening up the really big questions about what defines a civilization and how ideas of civilization can be used to define a state like India. Thanks, Anirudh. Like you said, we can't talk about all of Southeast Asian history in one episode. That would be quite absurd. And hopefully we'll have many more such conversations about Southeast Asia in different periods, interactions between Southeast Asian cultures and states and Indian cultures. Thank you once again. And thank you for joining us on All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST. or our website, takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Storytel and The Whole Truth Foods. Thank you for supporting us. We have a new show out this week, Candid Kannan with Siddharth Kannan. Sid K is a well-known RJ. He has an incredible show with some of the most amazing Bollywood celebrities. As part of the first week's episode, we're releasing 5 episodes at one time, so you can get your fill of Sid. You can hear him talk to Varun Dhawan, Anil Kapoor, Anurag Kashyap, Bhumi Pednekar, and a whole lot more. This week on the Edges and Sledges podcast with Varun, DJ, and Ashwin, hear them talk about the historic victory that India achieved at Gaba. Maruk Inayat had an amazing talk with Gul Panag. They spoke about the farmer protests and why Bollywood celebs are acting the way that they are. And finally, Shunya 1 is back this week. Shiladitya and me talked to Anirudh Singla from Pepper Content. We have a great lineup of guests coming up in the coming weeks, including Deepak Abid, the co-founder of India Gold. Definitely check that out. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
If you love cricket, listen up. The Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast is here for you. Hosted by DJ, Varun, and me, Ashwin, we bring a fun, fresh fan's point of view to talking all things cricket. Sometimes it's just the three of us, sometimes we have guests, including current and former international cricketers. For new episodes every week, check out the Edges and Sledges Cricket Podcast on the IVM app, website, or wherever you get your podcasts.